Hello, well in this film I'm going to show you how I make one of my saddle stitched belts. So that's a belt like this one with nice decorative stitching at the front. Quite fiddly to do, but well worth the effort. Well, I've got a nice bit of vegetable tanned hide here and it's a good thickness. So I've just got a wooden strap cutter here. I find these are quite effective. As a little tip, if you're cutting thick leathers, it's worth just putting a wedge of cardboard behind the cutter arm. So that gives us a nice belt blank. Now first off, I'm going to use a little grooving tool, and this is to cut a groove for the stitching. So I'll be doing this back and front, and the idea is to actually recess the stitching. So if you were to feel this finished belt, you can hardly feel the stitching as it's been set down in a channel. And obviously the reason for doing that is a nice little attention to detail, but it's actually to make sure that the buckle bar doesn't rub on the stitches and break them. So it's actually just recessed down a little bit. The other thing to say about all of this actually is I could in theory do this stitching on one of my sewing machines and I'd chomp through it quite happily. But what you wouldn't have is nice saddle stitching, and the feature about the saddle stitch is that if it were to break, it doesn't all unravel. If I did this on a sewing machine and the thread were to break in use, then it would all unravel and look awful. So that's why I'm doing this by hand with saddle stitch in a traditional way. I've never had one of these threads break because they're recessed down, but as I say, if it did, then it wouldn't unravel, and that's the real beauty of it. So I'll carefully start cutting this groove. And it just takes out a little whisper of leather. I'll do a couple of passes because I want this channel to be slightly deeper than the thread I'm using, so the stitches are properly recessed. So far I've made a couple of parallel lines here. What I'm going to do now is do the nice pointed ends. So this is a English point, and you could use a cardboard template and just scratch around with an awl to get that shape as a guideline, because you have to do this bit freehand, so it's a little bit tricky. What I personally do, I use one of my strap end punches, press it down, and you probably just about see this. Just one thing actually worth bearing in mind, if you do use one of these tools, it's very easy to mark the leather as you're going around those curved ends with this sort of stem of the tool. So in some ways it's not a bad idea to get one of these little pro tools. They come with about 5 different heads and an Allen key, and you can swap the bits out, but you can take the guide off and you can just then use it a bit like a pen, and it is easier to control. Get it wrong at this stage and your stitching will look rather sad. It's going alright. I'm at a little bit of an odd angle for me because of the camera. Right, well, that's my first little indentation, so that's taking the first layer out. I'll go over this again in a minute and I'll sink down a deeper level and I'll be able to smooth things up as I do that. That's the top channel done. I'll have to repeat that on the other side, but I'll do that after I've made the holes. What I'm going to do next actually is I'm going to mark in the actual buckle pinholes, and I use a template for this to make life easier. But basically the holes are spaced 1 inch apart. So I'm now using 1.5 inch end strap cutter and a nice tap with a mallet. And that's our end done. I'm now going to punch in the belt holes themselves. I'm using a number 23 punch for this. And the reason I'm doing this now is basically if I mess it up, well, the worst thing is I've lost a leather strap. I wouldn't want to be doing these after I've done the sewing, because you invest so much time in doing the sewing. you want to know you've got this spot on. So again, take my time. I sometimes do a faint impression just to check if that does look central, and it does. So that's the centre one done. I'll carry on and do the other holes. Once I've punched the holes, I'll just flatten them over so they sit nice and flat. Closes them in a little bit as well. So what we have there is the top channel done and the holes all made. So the next step is to make the holes for the sewing thread. As I say, I'm going to do a saddle stitch. I like using the chisels, so I'll show you one of those and how I use it. Here's one of the stitching chisels, and this is a 4-prong one, and you can probably just about see on camera they are actually very nicely set, each prong at an angle, so it gives you the exact kind of hole that you want, and you hit them with a hammer, goes through the leather and gives you a nice row of very precise holes. Now the other way of doing this is to use an awl, so a diamond shaped awl like one of these, and you can stab it through. It is quite hard work stabbing such a long length with an awl, so again, down to personal preference how you like to do it, but I find a stitching chisel, it's a lot less effort on your hands, you get a nice consistent pattern, so that's why I personally prefer it, but each to their own. And you can get the chisels. I made a little leather case for this lot, but you can get little sets, and they're quite reasonable to buy as well, but they are nice quality, they don't seem to bend, and they seem very good. So to use the stitching chisel, just make sure that you keep it very upright and accurately in the groove. If you have it going at an angle, you're going to have trouble when you come to cut your groove on the other side getting everything to line up, so it's important to keep that absolutely straight going up. And I've just got the usual cutting mat on my little anvil and a nylon hammer. And you can see it doesn't take too much pressure, and you get a nice little row of slanty holes, which is exactly what we need. To do the next set of holes, you just put the prong of your chisel in the last hole to line it up, and then bash away again. Keeping it nice and upright the whole time. There you are. I'll carry on doing that. When you come to a corner, one needs to use one of the smaller chisels, so you can get different sets of points. Here's a 2-prong, which I'll be using when I come to do the corners to get around that curve. So that's all the holes punched on the top surface. So the next task now is to groove a channel on this inside edge as well, so that the thread gets sunk down. Again, I'm making sure that the channel is at least the depth of the actual thread. So it's a nice thick bit of leather, this. It's about 3.5mm thick. Now I'm going to be using red stitching for this one, and I'm going to be using what a lot of people call tiger thread, fairly obvious reasons. And this is Ritzer 25 Julie's cock, and it's very good. It's a nice sort of braided thread, pre-waxed, and it's a very nice quality thread indeed. It comes on big rolls, rather expensive on the big rolls. There is an option if you don't want to get a big roll or get a sample roll or something. There's a Chinese variant of this which is actually pretty good. It's similar shade, a little bit darker, it's waxed, it's braided, and it's a lot cheaper. So that is an option. It doesn't sit quite so nicely, but it is perfectly okay. But I'll be using tiger thread. Now I've just threaded this needle, and actually to keep the thread on the needle, it's a good idea to actually pierce the thread with the needle. So you actually then pull the thread through the needle, back on itself, and that sort of locks it on. It's a nice slim knot in effect, and that needle now won't go missing. It would be easy to forget to do the edge shaving, so I'm just going to use a rounded shave, and I'm going to just take the corners off the belt leather. When you round the corners, it just makes the belt so much more comfortable for someone to wear. You end up with a long, very thin bootlace. So that's giving it a nice rounded edge, and what I'll do now, I'll dye that edge and polish it. And I'm doing that obviously before I do the stitching, because if any dye does drift over, it won't colour the stitching. So just draining the dye off the wool dauber, and then just running the dye along the belt edge. Fine, if you go both ways, it gets it nicely down into the grain of the leather. Or just go and wipe the top edge before it has a chance to soak in. I'm just polishing the edge using my slicker, and that puts all the fibres down and gives a nice shiny edge. And just flatten off the edge where it's got pushed slightly to keep it nice and flat. So this will take a little while, but it's sort of quite relaxing in its own way. So my slicker's just got grooves for different thicknesses of leather. So that's what the edge looks like before polishing, and after polishing it's more like that. This is all now ready for some stitching. You need quite a long bit of thread to go through all of this. I'm just drawing it through each time. I won't go into the detail of how I do the saddle stitching, because there are lots of films already on YouTube. The important thing to make sure is that you get your needles going in the same place each direction. So what you want to do is, if one needle's always at the bottom of a slanted stitch hole, make sure you keep it that way throughout, otherwise you'll end up with rather ugly looking stitches which won't settle very nicely on the back. And it's a good idea to pull it through and make sure, check your work every now and again that it's sitting nice and flush. Now this is quite a time consuming process and there's no escaping it, but it's quite enjoyable in its own way. I quite like it. It's very nice and in a funny sort of way relaxing. So each time I'm popping these needles through, I'm making sure, in this case, my needle in my right hand is going down low and my needle in my left hand is going up high. And the other thing I do is, with the one in my right hand going through, I just give it a gentle little push down, but I don't pull it all the way through, or the thread completely out to the end, in case the other needle going through gets jammed on the thread. It's easier then to have some length of thread to pull it through. So hopefully you can see that. So that's the first inch done. There's another 25 inches to go. Again, just worth checking, this is the reverse side, to make sure that all your stitches are nice and even. And if you just run your finger over, you shouldn't be able to feel any of the stitches because they're sunk below the surface. And that will be the same with the front. You may just feel a tiniest bit, but you really shouldn't be feeling much stitch at all, because you want those to be underneath. Just want to make sure those corner points sit nicely, so it's worth taking a little bit more effort on those. It's rather cold today, so I have a nice fire burning. I'm making good progress with the stitching, taking my time to get it nicely set. I'm holding my work in my traditional saddler's clam, and this is one that I made myself. It's a nice tool to use. I have lined the jaws with very thin bits of calf leather just to protect the work, and you don't really want too much springiness on these jaws. You want it to hold the leather but not to mark it, so there's a happy balance there, but this seems to work very happily. So I'm just carrying on doing the stitching, and I try and work it so that, as I say, you keep the same entry position, same exit position on each of the needles. I'm just coming to the end now, so final stitches going in. And I'm going to go one forward, well, actually probably 4 back, make it nice and strong, and snip them off at the back. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to go over my stitches with a stitch roller wheel to sink them down. I'm going to flatten off the surface around the stitches and hammer them down to get them all sitting nice and flush. So with the hammering down, I'm just getting everything nicely compressed down. So what I'm going to do next is run over the stitches with my stitch marking wheel, and that just helps push them down and keeps them nice and tidy looking. This stitch marking wheel is at the same holes per inch as my stitching chisels, so it'll push the stitches down properly below the surface. So that's what you get at the back. You see all those stitches are nicely sunk below, and then at the front you get this lovely stitching. I think the contrast with the brown and the red looks very nice. So there you are. And this is for someone who saw one of my other ones and said, "Oh, could you do one of those for me in red, please?" So this is for them. So final things now is to put the buckle on, make the keeper, and repolish the edges. So that's what I'll be doing next. So to mark out the buckle fittings, I have a little template that I put over, and it just means I get all the nice holes and everything, and the crew slot all nicely lined up. So first of all, it's the strap end. And then it's the holes for riveting. And then finally it's the large screw punch for the buckle. Double check my position of that. There we are. So there are holes. I'll just flatten all of that off. So that's ready to take the buckle. What I will do underneath here is actually thin off the leather. I skive it down so that it sits nice and flat in front of the person's waist. It's a little detail, but all these little details, they add up to make a nice belt. I'm just going to put my Bucklehurst logo into the leather of the belt. So I'm using a 1 ton press for this. So that gives my logo, and in my hand I've got the die that I use with the 1 ton press. So I've just been thinning off the back behind the buckle, so it's a nice slimmed down tab there, just using a little skiving knife for that. I'm just cutting a bit of leather now to make the belt loop. And it's very similar to making the belt. I'm just going to round off the edges, polish them, stain them, and then make it up. Thin off the belt loop. Then I soak it so it makes the leather bend without actually breaking on itself. And then I can bend it round and see how it is for size. Right, just riveting on the buckle. Then goes the keeper. There you are, one finished belt. So rather nice, I think that's the red stitching sets off very nicely with the leather, and it's a nice solid brass buckle. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed watching that one, and thanks very much. And if you're looking for belts, have a look on my online shop, so you'll find quite a few nice belts there. Bye bye.